What if I told you that the same government that once punished children for speaking their native tongue later begged their fathers to use that very language to win a war? What if the most devastating psychological weapon of World War II wasn't a bomb, wasn't a tank, but words spoken in a language the enemy could never hope to crack? Before we dive into this story that challenges everything you thought you knew about World War II, I need something from you. First, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is discovering this untold chapter of history. Second, hit that subscribe button. Your subscription isn't just a number to me. It's what allows us to keep uncovering these buried truths, stories that have been hidden in classified files and fading memories for over 8 decades now. Let's begin. The year was 1940, and across America's Southwest, something strange was happening in the darkness of government boarding schools. Apache children were being beaten for speaking the only language they knew. Their mouths were washed with soap. Their hands were struck with rulers. Teachers would stand before classrooms and declare with absolute certainty, "You will forget this savage tongue. You will speak English, or you will speak nothing at all." One of those children was a boy named John Dazen. He was 7 years old when federal agents took him from his mother's arms on the San Carlos Apache Reservation in Arizona. For the next 6 years, he would not speak a single word of Apache aloud, but in his mind, in the quiet hours before sleep, he recited the words his grandfather had taught him. Stories of warriors who moved like wind through canyon walls, prayers to spirits that lived in the mountains, names for things that had no translation in English. He remembered because something inside him knew, though he could not have explained how, that one day those words would matter. That one day the language they were trying to destroy would be the only thing standing between survival and annihilation. That day came on December 7th, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor shattered America's sense of invulnerability. Within weeks, the nation was at war on two fronts, and within months, military strategists faced a problem that no amount of firepower could solve. The Japanese were breaking every code the Americans created. Radio communications were being intercepted. Battle plans were being deciphered. American soldiers were walking into ambushes because the enemy knew exactly where they would be and exactly when they would arrive. In the European theater, German intelligence was proving equally effective. Encrypted messages that should have taken weeks to crack were being read in hours. Men were dying because of information leaks. Entire operations were failing before they even began. In a classified meeting at the Pentagon in March 1942, a colonel named Frank Knox presented a radical idea. He had read a report about World War I, about how the Choctaw language had been used successfully for field communications. The report noted that not a single message sent in Choctaw had been decoded by the Germans. What if, Knox suggested, we found a language so rare, so complex, that the enemy couldn't possibly break it? What if we found speakers of that language who were also soldiers? The room fell silent. Then someone asked the obvious question, "What language are you proposing?" Knox laid a map on the table. His finger traced a path through Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Texas. "Apache," he said. "There are fewer than 5,000 fluent speakers left. No written grammar, no textbooks, and a syntax so different from European languages that even trained linguists can barely grasp the basics." Another officer objected immediately. "We spent 50 years trying to eliminate that language from government schools. You're suggesting we now rely on it?" Knox's response was simple, yes, because the irony of our mistake might just save American lives. Finding Apache speakers who were also willing to enlist proved more difficult than anticipated. The reservations remembered too well the broken promises, the forced relocations, the systematic destruction of their culture. Many Apache families had good reason to distrust any request from the federal government. But there was a man named Philip Johnston who understood how to bridge that gap. Johnston was white, but he had grown up on the Navajo reservation where his parents were missionaries. He spoke Navajo fluently and understood the deep cultural frameworks of Southwestern tribes. He had proposed the Navajo Code Talker program and now turned his attention to recruiting Apache speakers. Johnston traveled to the reservations with a simple message. "Your sons are dying in this war whether you help us or not. But if you help us, your language, the language they tried to take from you, can become the weapon that brings them home." It was a calculated appeal, but it worked. By the summer of 1942, the first Apache volunteers began arriving at training facilities. They were a diverse group. Some were young men like John Dazen, who had been forbidden to speak Apache as children but had never forgotten. Others were older, men in their 30s and 40s who remembered when Apache was the only language spoken in their families. The military initially planned to use them the same way they used Navajo code talkers, as radio operators who would translate English commands into Apache. But something unexpected happened during training. The training officer was a captain named Robert Henderson. He had fought in North Africa and seen firsthand how quickly the Germans adapted to new encryption methods. He was skeptical that any language-based code would remain secure for long. "Give me your best encryption," he told the Apache recruits during their first week. "Send a message that I can intercept, and I'll have my intelligence team try to crack it." The recruits conferred among themselves. Then one of them, a man named Wilson Sky, stepped forward. "We won't just use Apache," he said. "We'll use it the way our grandfathers did, the way warriors communicated when they needed absolute secrecy." Henderson didn't understand the distinction, but he agreed. "Fine, send your message." What happened next would change everything. Wilson and three other Apache soldiers sat in a circle. They didn't use radio equipment. They didn't write anything down. Instead, they began speaking in a rhythm that Henderson had never heard before, half conversation, half chant, full of pauses and repetitions that seemed to carry meaning beyond the words themselves. After 10 minutes, they stopped. Wilson turned to Henderson. "The message is sent." "Sent where?" Henderson asked. "You didn't use the radio." "Didn't need to," Wilson replied. "The others received it." Henderson looked confused. "What others?" Wilson gestured to a building half a mile away where more Apache recruits were stationed. "They know the message now. You can go ask them." Henderson thought it was a trick, but when he walked to the other building and asked the Apache soldiers there what message had been sent, they repeated it word for word. "Enemy forces gathering at Northern Ridge. 40 men. 3 vehicles. Attack at dawn." Henderson returned, shaken. "How did you do that?" Wilson smiled, but there was something in his eyes that made Henderson uncomfortable. "You asked us to use Apache the way our grandfathers did. This is how they communicated across distances, when they hunted, when they fought. This is what you killed our language for, and this is what might save your soldiers now." That night, Henderson wrote in his report, "These men possess communication capabilities beyond standard encryption. Recommend immediate deployment and further study of methodology." He had no idea what he had just unleashed. The Apache communication specialists, they were never officially called code talkers. That designation belonged to the Navajo, were deployed to the Pacific Theater in October 1942. Their first mission was on Guadalcanal, where American forces were engaged in brutal jungle warfare against entrenched Japanese positions. The Japanese had been intercepting American radio communications with devastating effectiveness. Every time American commanders planned an assault, the Japanese seemed to know exactly where it was coming. Casualties were mounting. The Apache specialists were assigned to a Marine battalion commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Puller. Puller was a hard man who had fought in Nicaragua and Haiti. He didn't believe in mysticism or exotic solutions. He believed in firepower and discipline. When he was told that his communications would now be handled by Apache soldiers using their native language, he was openly skeptical. "I need reliability," he told the commanding officer who delivered the orders. "I need communications that work every time, not some experiment with Indians who speak gibberish." The commanding officer's response was blunt. "These Indians kept their language alive, despite everything we did to destroy it. Maybe you should trust that they know how to use it." The first test came during a nighttime reconnaissance mission. A Marine patrol had gone silent behind enemy lines. Radio contact was lost. Standard protocol would be to assume the patrol was compromised and write them off. But one of the Apache specialists, a man named Thomas Nashley, told Puller he could locate them. "How?" Puller demanded. "Let me try," was all Thomas said. Puller, desperate and with nothing to lose, agreed. Thomas sat on the jungle floor, closed his eyes, and began speaking in Apache. Not into a radio, not to anyone visible, just speaking into the darkness, his voice low and rhythmic. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. The Marines around him shifted uncomfortably. Someone muttered that they were wasting time. Then Thomas opened his eyes. They're alive, 2 miles northeast, pinned down by a machine gun nest. 3 injured. If we move now, we can extract them before dawn. Puller stared at him. How the hell do you know that? They told me. Told me, Thomas replied. There's no radio contact. They couldn't have. They told me. Thomas repeated with a firmness that ended the conversation. Puller made a decision that would haunt and validate him for the rest of his life. He ordered a rescue mission based entirely on information that had no rational source. The patrol was exactly where Thomas said they would be. All 9 Marines were extracted alive. When Puller demanded an explanation, the patrol leader looked confused. We didn't send any communication, sir. We couldn't. Radio was destroyed in the initial contact. Then how did he know where you were? The patrol leader hesitated, then said something that made every Marine in earshot go quiet. There was a voice, sir. We all heard it, asking us where we were, asking if we were injured. We thought it was in our heads at first, some kind of stress reaction. But we all heard the same thing, so we answered. And I guess he heard us. I know this sounds impossible. I know it challenges everything we think we know about communication and reality. But before you dismiss this as fiction, understand that there are classified military documents, heavily redacted, but accessible through persistence, that reference unconventional communication methodologies used by Native American units in Wopwit. Documents that note success rates that standard cryptography could never achieve. Documents that recommend the methods never be disclosed to the public. If this story is resonating with you, if you're realizing there's so much hidden history we've never been taught, do me a favor, hit that like button and share this video. The algorithm buries content like this, but together we can make sure these truths don't stay buried. Now let's continue. Word of the Apache specialist abilities spread through the Pacific Theater like wildfire. Not officially, these communications were still classified, but in the way soldiers always share information that might keep them alive. Units began requesting Apache attachment. Commanders who had initially been skeptical found themselves desperate for these quiet men who could somehow coordinate attacks with a precision that seemed supernatural. But something else was spreading too. Fear among the Japanese forces. Captured Japanese soldiers began telling interrogators about voices in the jungle. Voices that spoke in a language that hurt to hear, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Voices that preceded American attacks by minutes, giving warnings the Japanese couldn't intercept or understand. One captured officer, a captain named Hideaki Yamamoto, described an experience that would be repeated in dozens of similar accounts. His unit had been dug into a defensive position, confident they were hidden, when he heard something that made his blood freeze. It was like singing, he told the interrogator through a translator. But not any singing I had ever heard. It had no melody, but it had power. It made my chest hurt. It made my mind feel stretched, like I was being pulled in 2 directions. And then I knew, I don't know how I knew, but I knew with absolute certainty that Americans were coming from the West, not the North where we expected them. The West. He had ordered his men to reposition, and that decision saved most of their lives. The American attack came exactly as the voice had somehow told him. But here's what I don't understand, Yamamoto continued. The voice wasn't warning me. It wasn't trying to help me. It was just announcing, like a storm announces itself with thunder. Inevitable, unstoppable, beyond any human decision. The interrogator filed this report along with dozens of others that described similar phenomena. Military psychologists analyzed them and concluded they were evidence of combat stress, perhaps compounded by propaganda about American Indian savagery. But the psychologists were wrong. What the military didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that the Apache specialists weren't using language the way European minds conceptualized it. In Western thinking, language is a tool for conveying information from one mind to another. Words are symbols that represent objects and ideas. Communication is fundamentally transactional, but in Apache tradition, language is something more primal. It's a way of shaping reality itself. Words don't just describe the world, they participate in it. They have power not because of arbitrary meaning assigned by humans, but because they tap into something older, something that exists beneath the surface of conscious thought. The specials had been trained in this understanding by elders who still remembered the old ways. Men like Thomas Yellowhorse, who was nearly 90 years old when the war began, but whose mind was sharp as obsidian. Thomas taught the young Apache soldiers something the military never knew they were learning. He taught them that there were layers to their language. The surface layer, which could be translated into English and used for basic military communications, and a deeper layer which couldn't be translated because it didn't work through the same mechanisms as normal speech. This deeper layer was what their ancestors had used to coordinate hunts across vast distances, to warn each other of danger without alerting prey or enemies, to maintain connection with their people even when separated by mountains and canyons. It wasn't telepathy exactly, it was something that didn't have a word in English, a way of speaking that used sound and intention and something else, something that traveled through channels the modern world had forgotten existed. When Thomas taught this to the young soldiers, some of them resisted. They had been raised in boarding schools, had been taught that such ideas were primitive superstition. But Thomas would smile his ancient smile and ask them a simple question. When you speak English, do you feel it in your chest, in your bones, or only in your mouth? They had to admit, English lived only in their mouths, in their conscious minds. But when you speak our language, Thomas continued, when you speak it the way I'm teaching you, where do you feel it? And they had to admit they felt it everywhere, in their chests, in their spines, in places they didn't have names for. That's because you're not just making sounds, Thomas explained. You're touching something real, something that was here before humans and will be here after. The Americans want you to use our language to hide their messages, but what you're really doing is so much more. You're reaching through the world they see into the world that actually is. And in that world, distance means something different. Time means something different. And communication doesn't require machines. The young soldiers learned, and what they learned terrified them even as it empowered them. Because Thomas was right. Once they understood how to speak in that deeper register, they could feel each other across miles of jungle. They could sense danger before it arrived. They could coordinate without technology, but they could also feel something else, something watching, something listening. It started small. An Apache specialist named David Naichi was the first to report it, though others had been feeling it for weeks without mentioning it. He was in his tent after a particularly intense day of combat operations when he felt what he later described as eyes on the back of my neck, but coming from inside my head. He turned around expecting to see one of the other soldiers, but he was alone. The feeling didn't go away. If anything, it intensified. Something was in the tent with him. Not physically. He could see every corner, see that nothing was there. But something was present in a way that bypassed his physical senses entirely. Then he heard it, a voice speaking in Apache. But it wasn't the Apache he knew. It was older, stranger, with inflections that seemed to come from a time before grammar had settled into its current patterns. The voice said something that David would never fully translate, but which he understood with a clarity that transcended words. You have opened the path. We walk it now. David reported this to his commanding officer, who dismissed it as combat fatigue. But within a week, every Apache specialist in the Pacific was reporting similar experiences. They all felt watched. They all heard voices in a language that was Apache, but somehow more than Apache, and they all understood, with a certainty that grew stronger each day, that they had done something that couldn't be undone. By using their language in that deep register, by reaching through the layers of reality to communicate across distances, they had created a channel, and that channel went both ways. Something had noticed. Something had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening, and now it was coming through. In the spring of 1943, Thomas Yellowhorse sent a message to the Military Liaison Office in Arizona. The message requested immediate recall of all Apache communications specialists to the reservation for cultural ceremonies necessary to maintain unit cohesion. The request was denied. The specialists were too valuable, too necessary to the war effort. Thomas sent another message, more urgent. The doors must be closed. The young men do not know what they have opened. Bring them home before it is too late. Again denied. Thomas sent a final message, and this one was marked as so urgent that it eventually reached someone with enough clearance to understand its implications. The message read, "You have asked our sons to speak with power they do not understand. You have asked them to reach into places where your science does not work. They have done this because you asked, because they love this country despite everything it has done to them. But there are things listening in those places, things that your weapons cannot fight, things that will follow them home. I am 93 years old. I fought in the last Apache Wars. I watched Geronimo surrender. I have seen what happens when the old powers are invoked without proper protection. For the love of God, bring them home before they bring something back that will consume us all." The message was filed away, classified, and ignored. 3 months later, Thomas Yellowhorse was found dead in his home on the reservation. The official cause was heart failure, natural for a man his age. But those who prepared his body for burial noted something strange. His hands were positioned in a warding gesture, fingers forming symbols that the younger generation didn't recognize. And on every window and door of his home, he had painted marks in red ochre, marks that the elders identified as ancient protection symbols, the kind used to seal spaces against intrusion from the spirit world. Thomas had died trying to hold something back, something he knew was coming, something that his young warriors had unknowingly invited in. Despite the growing unease among the Apache specialists, their military effectiveness only increased. By mid-1943, they were coordinating complex multi-unit operations with a precision that seemed impossible. During the assault on Tarawa, an Apache specialist named Wilson Sky, the same man who had first demonstrated the unconventional communication method to Captain Henderson, coordinated landing forces across a 3-mile beachhead without using radio equipment once. Commanders watching from command ships couldn't understand how the different Marine units were moving in such perfect synchronization. Every attack wave hit its target within seconds of the others. Every flanking maneuver unfolded with split-second timing. When questioned afterward, Wilson's explanation was simple. We all knew where everyone was. We all knew what needed to happen. So it happened. But the cost was becoming clear to those who knew where to look. The Apache specialists were changing. They slept less, ate less, spoke less. They spent more time sitting in silence, eyes closed, seemingly listening to something no one else could hear. And they were seeing things. One of them, a man named Albert Nezi, confided in a chaplain that he was being followed by shadows that weren't cast by any light source. Shadows that moved independently, that seemed to watch him with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. The chaplain, a Catholic priest named Father Michael Donnelly, initially assumed Albert was suffering from trauma-induced hallucinations. But after several conversations, Father Donnelly became convinced that something genuinely abnormal was occurring. He wrote in his private journal, "This young man is not insane. Whatever he is experiencing has a coherence and consistency that mental illness lacks." He describes these entities with a specificity that suggests objective reality rather than subjective delusion. More disturbingly, he accepts their presence with a fatalism that borders on surrender. When I asked him why he doesn't report this to his superiors, he said, "They would not understand. We made a bargain without knowing we were making it. Now we pay the price." This is how it has always been with power. Father Donnelly tried to help. He performed blessings, prayers, even an informal exorcism. Nothing changed the situation. The shadows remained. Eventually, Father Donnelly came to a disturbing conclusion, which he recorded in his journal. "I fear that traditional Christian protections are ineffective here because we are dealing with something that predates Christianity, something rooted in this land, in its original peoples and their understanding of reality. These young men have accessed something ancient by using their ancestral language in its full power, and that something has claimed them as its own. I pray for their souls, but I do not know if my prayers reach where they have gone." We're going to take a brief pause here because I need to ask you something important. Are you starting to understand why this story has been buried? Why the military classified these reports and why mainstream history pretends this never happened? This isn't just about winning battles with an unbreakable code. This is about confronting realities that our modern, rational world refuses to acknowledge. If you're still with me, if you want to know how this ends, leave a comment right now. Tell me, I'm ready for the truth. Because what comes next is going to challenge everything you think you know about the nature of reality itself. And please, subscribe if you haven't already. The powers that suppress this information are counting on you to forget, to scroll past, to dismiss this as fantasy. Prove them wrong. Now let's continue into the darkness. The war in the Pacific was reaching its climax. American forces were island hopping toward Japan, and the fighting was becoming more desperate with each engagement. The Apache specialists continued their work, but something had fundamentally shifted. They no longer needed to be briefed on missions. They would know what was required before officers could explain it. They would move to positions before being ordered. They would provide intelligence that hadn't been gathered by any reconnaissance. Commanders praised their effectiveness while quietly noting in classified reports that something about these men had become deeply unsettling. During the battle for Iwo Jima in February 1945, an incident occurred that would become legendary among those few who knew about it. A Marine company was pinned down on the volcanic slopes, taking heavy casualties from Japanese artillery positioned in caves that aerial reconnaissance hadn't been able to locate. The situation was desperate. Three Apache specialists, John Dazen, Wilson Sky, and Albert Nezi, volunteered to locate the artillery positions. They walked into the killing field unarmed. They didn't take cover. They simply walked, slowly and deliberately, toward the Japanese lines while explosions bracketed their path. Marines watching through binoculars reported something impossible. The artillery shells weren't hitting the three men. Not because the men were dodging or because the Japanese were missing. The shells were landing all around them, but somehow, impossibly, none of the shrapnel touched them. It was as if they were walking through a space that existed slightly apart from the battle, occupying the same terrain but not the same reality. They reached the Japanese cave system, stood outside it for several minutes, then calmly walked back to American lines. When they returned, John Dawson provided exact coordinates for 7 artillery positions. "You can shell them now," he said. "They won't be able to fire back." The coordinates were relayed. The American artillery opened up. Every Japanese gun emplacement was destroyed in the first salvo. But here's what the official report doesn't mention. When American forces eventually captured those caves 3 days later, they found something inexplicable. The Japanese gunners were dead, but not from American artillery. There were no wounds. They had died before the shelling began. They had died while the 3 Apache specialists stood outside their caves. The medic who examined the bodies wrote in his personal log, "Cause of death unknown, no physical trauma. All subjects show signs of extreme psychological distress. Pupils fully dilated, facial muscles locked in expressions of terror. Several subjects appear to have died from cardiac arrest simultaneously. One officer appears to have shot himself in the head, but there is no corresponding weapon near the body. Whatever killed these men, it wasn't conventional warfare." The war ended in August 1945. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought Japan's surrender. The Apache specialists, along with millions of other American servicemen, began the long journey home. But they knew they weren't returning unchanged. During the weeks-long voyage across the Pacific, the Apache specialists kept to themselves. Other soldiers learned to avoid the section of the ship where they stayed. The lights in that section flickered constantly. The temperature dropped noticeably when you got near. And at night, crew members reported hearing voices, not speaking in English or Apache or any recognizable language, but something older, something that made your teeth ache and your vision blur. One sailor, a young man from Iowa named Robert Chen, made the mistake of walking through that section late one night. He later described the experience to a naval psychiatrist. They were sitting in a circle, all of them, eyes closed, and they were humming or chanting or something. It was quiet, but it felt loud, like it was vibrating through my bones, through the metal of the ship. And then I saw them, the other things, the things sitting in the circle with them. Things that looked like men but weren't shaped right. Things that cast shadows that went the wrong direction. I ran, and I didn't look back. And I've been having nightmares ever since. Nightmares where those things turn toward me, where they see me. And I know with absolute certainty that if they ever fully notice me, I'll never wake up. The ship docked in San Diego. The Apache specialists disembarked separately from other troops. There were no families waiting for them, no welcome home celebrations. Instead, they were met by unmarked military vehicles that took them to a facility in the California desert. For 3 weeks, they were kept in isolation while military doctors conducted examinations. The doctors found no physical ailments, but the psychological evaluations revealed something deeply concerning. Every single Apache specialist reported the same experience. They felt watched constantly, not by anything human, but by the presences they had contacted during the war. They described these presences as neither malevolent nor benevolent, simply ancient and utterly inhuman in their perspective. One doctor's report stated, subject reports sensation of being claimed by entities he describes as the ones who listen. Subject shows no signs of psychosis or delusion. Affect is flat, resigned. When asked if he fears these entities, subject replied, you don't fear the mountain, you don't fear the storm. These things simply are. We called to them by using the deep language. They answered, now they will always be there. This is the price we paid to help you win your war. The military had no framework for dealing with this. Eventually, after bureaucratic hand-wringing and classified meetings, the decision was made to discharge the Apache specialists with full honors, seal all records of their service, and hope the problem would resolve itself. It didn't. The Apache specialists returned to their reservations in Arizona and New Mexico. They tried to resume normal lives. They took jobs, married, started families. But they were forever marked by what they had done and what they had awakened. The elders on the reservation recognized the change immediately. These young men had walked paths that were not meant to be walked in the modern age. They had opened connections to forces that required careful, ceremonial containment. Purification ceremonies were conducted. Sacred rituals that had not been performed in generations were revived. The elders did everything they could to help the returned warriors find balance. But the doors they had opened during the war would not fully close. Children born to the Apache specialists reported strange dreams. Dreams of places that never were, of presences that spoke without words, of knowing things they had no way of knowing. Some of these children grew up with abilities that defied explanation. They would know when relatives were in danger miles away. They would speak in their sleep in the deep register of Apache, the Oli language, saying things that made the elders weep with recognition and fear. And the specialists themselves never found peace. John Dawson lived until 1989. In his final years, he gave a single interview to a researcher from Arizona State University. His words, recorded on aging cassette tape, capture the reality of what these men endured. People thank me for my service. They shake my hand. They say I helped win the war. And I did. We did. But they don't understand the bond. Every night since 1943, I have been aware of something watching me. Not with eyes, with something else. An attention that comes from a place your science doesn't acknowledge. I use my language as a weapon, and in doing so, I opened a door that cannot be closed. My children feel it. My grandchildren feel it. And their children will feel it. We did what was asked of us. We saved American lives. But we paid for it with something more valuable than our own lives. We paid with the innocence of generations yet to come. That is the real cost of war. Not the dead, but not the dead, but the changed. Not the bodies left on battlefields, but the souls that return carrying weights no one else can see. Wilson Sky died in 1972, found in his home on the reservation with no apparent cause of death. Those who found him reported that every window and door was marked with symbols they didn't recognize, that the temperature in the house was freezing despite it being July, and that his final expression was not one of pain or fear, but of recognition, as if, in his last moment, he had finally seen fully what he had only sensed throughout the decades since the war. Albert Nezi lived the longest, dying in 2002 at the age of 83. In his final days, he gathered his family and told them something that still haunts them. The ones we spoke to during the war are patient. They exist outside of time as you understand it. They have waited, and they will continue to wait. But they never forget. We called to them in the language of power, and they answered. That debt will echo through our bloodline until someone finds a way to pay it fully. I do not know if that is possible. I only know that we did what we thought was right, and in doing so, we bound ourselves and our descendants to something infinite. Today, the files on the Apache communications specialists remain classified. What little has been released through Freedom of Information Act requests is so heavily redacted as to be almost meaningless. The military officially denies that any unconventional communication methods were employed during World War II. The success of Native American code talkers is attributed entirely to the complexity of their languages, nothing more. But there are whispers among those who know. Whispers about programs that tried to replicate what the Apache specialists did. Programs that were shut down after researchers began reporting psychological breakdowns, apparitions, and phenomena that couldn't be explained by conventional science. There are reports buried deep in Pentagon archives of experiments in the 1950s and 60s that attempted to use similar linguistic and ceremonial techniques for Cold War espionage. These programs were terminated not because they didn't work, but because they worked too well and brought with them consequences that no military commander was prepared to handle. And there are the descendants, the children and grandchildren of the Apache specialists who carry something in their blood, something in their consciousness that sets them apart. Some have learned to live with it. Others have been destroyed by it. One grandson, speaking anonymously to a researcher in 2018, described his experience. I have never been to war. I have never learned the deep language that my grandfather used. But I feel them anyway, the watchers, the ones who listen. They are always there, just at the edge of perception, and sometimes in dreams or in moments of extreme stress, I hear them speaking. Not in words, in something underneath words. And I understand. I understand that my grandfather made a bargain, and I am part of the price. This story challenges everything our modern, rational civilization wants to believe about reality. We want to believe that language is just symbols, that communication is just information transfer, that the universe operates according to fixed physical laws that we're steadily uncovering. But what if we're wrong? What if the indigenous peoples of this land understood something that we've forgotten in our rush to technological advancement? What if language, used in certain ways, can actually touch dimensions of reality that our scientific instruments cannot measure? The Apache specialists discovered this truth. They used their ancestral language not just to encrypt messages, but to reach through the fabric of ordinary reality into something deeper. And in doing so, they contacted forces that exist outside our normal understanding. They won battles without firing shots. They coordinated across impossible distances. They struck terror into enemies who couldn't understand what was happening to them. But they also opened doors that could never fully close. They made contact with intelligences that are still watching, still waiting, still exerting influence on their descendants decades after the war ended. This is the hidden cost of victory. This is the price paid by warriors who were asked to weaponize their most sacred cultural knowledge. This is the truth that the military classified, that historians ignore, that our rational modern world refuses to acknowledge. The language America tried to erase became its most powerful weapon. But that weapon had a price, and we're still paying it. If this story has moved you, if it's opened your eyes to dimensions of history and reality that you'd never considered, I need you to do something. Don't let this truth be buried again. Share this video. Leave a comment about how this has changed your perspective. Subscribe so you never miss the stories that the powerful don't want you to hear. Because this isn't just history. This is a warning about what happens when we treat sacred knowledge as a tool. When we weaponize spiritual power without understanding its true nature. When we open doors without knowing how to close them. The Apache specialists sacrificed everything to help win a war. The least we can do is remember their truth. All of it, not just the sanitized version that fits our comfortable worldview. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And may God protect us all from the doors that remain open.